Okay, so it turns out it's not actually possible to read 5 books in 1 week, and I was kind of clowned for suggesting that I could, so these are probably gonna be monthly videos, sorry. Also, I don't have 2 of the books that I read. They're currently in Boston, but I filmed the reviews there, so when you see a location change, that's Boston. So we're gonna pretend that I intended this to be a monthly thing. Okay guys? Great. So the first book I read was Automatic Eve, a book that I did not ask for but was given. Love those types of books. But this book, it does look cool. It seemed promising. I already forgot what the premise was, but I remember it seemed good. Oh, okay, it's basically about like a shogunate. Okay, actually, let's start with the biggest issue with this book. It's translated from Japanese, so I'm not reading it in its intended form, and it shows in the writing style. Basically, the concept is that there's these... Actually, I was misled. Here's what I thought the concept was. There's some type of AI, robot, Westworld shit going on in, like, the Japanese emperor, like, versus the shogunate, and they're, like, going head to head, but there's, like, you know, secret robots everywhere or something. I guess that's what I thought it was about. I don't know why. But, it's actually 5 separate stories that don't fully relate to each other, all set in the same place, about Eve, who is a robot. So it's 5 separate characters that like have some type of interaction with Eve, the robot, in this, like, against the setting of the shogunate versus the emperor. So I had a couple issues with this book. The first one is that I DNF'd this book for like 3 months. I read about halfway through this book and then I dropped it because it was too boring and I couldn't get through it. And then I picked it up recently, like a few weeks ago, and I finished it. But obviously I did not really remember the first half, and that did not matter at all. All the plot stuff that matters happens in the second half because I literally didn't remember the first half and that didn't matter. The second half is a lot faster paced. It's a lot more interesting. The narrators, because before it was changing narrators every story, they start becoming the same people, or they start actually having, you know, interactions with each other, so you're like, oh, that was the guy from that story, oh, he's talking to oh, they're all connected, and it finally starts like coming together. I cannot give this book more than 3 stars just because of how hard it was for me to get through the first half, and the fact that, like, I feel like if you can drop half a book and then still like finish it and understand what happened, then what the fuck was going on in that first half? What's going on here, guys? But I would like to be totally clear that this book was intended to be read in Japanese, so it probably was better in Japanese. I will never know. But personally, I would say second half was actually kind of cool. There were some cool elements in it. I enjoyed the final, like, battle climax. I thought it all came together nicely. There were a couple reveals that were sort of set up in the first half that kind of came together in the second half, but I didn't really remember the setup, but I just remembered being like, oh, I think that makes more sense now. I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you want to read this, just don't read the first half of the book, which is not a great thing to say. One final thing I have to say is that I think there's something in the first story, and I don't remember well enough to know that this is 100% true, that is literally just straight up a plot hole. Like, later, because of some of the other reveals, something that was revealed in the first story, like, literally just doesn't make sense anymore, but I will not be rereading to check. So I'm gonna give this book 3 stars because it was very hard for me to get through at the beginning. But it, you know, it picked up. It has some good times towards the end. It had like a decent climax. Eve was interesting sometimes. Basically, it was everyone thought she was hot and weak. Turns out she's a robot. But then, like, for 5 stories. So 3 stars. The next book I'm gonna talk about I don't have because I borrowed it from a friend, but it is Half Bad by... You know what, it's pretty famous. If you look it up, you can find it. Anyway, Half Bad. That book, I have to say, reminded me that I actually enjoy reading because I've been trying to get through all of these, like, serious, you know, like, classic type of, like, strong meaning books, but Half Bad was just a fun YA read. You know, I had a great time reading that book. I literally read it in like 2 settings, and it's like a 500 page book, and I didn't even like notice because it was just so fast paced. The character was interesting. It was a cool premise. It's kind of like, basically there are evil witches and there are good witches, and there's this kid who's like a half-blood, the main character, between the both of them, and he's super discriminated against because his father is one of the most evil of the evil witches. So he basically gets like tortured and beaten up, but like and like just discriminated against his whole life. And his perspective is actually really interesting. It's kind of unique because he's not, I don't know, he's like, I don't want to say he's simple, but like he never had like a real education. He's not good at school, and it kind of shows in the writing style, which I liked. I thought that was pretty unique. But I had a great time reading this book. It flew by so fast. I would give it 4 stars just because it's like a good, fun quarantine read. So I would recommend it for anyone who liked Harry Potter, anyone who just likes YA. I would say my only downside is that the character is pretty much alone. So like he doesn't meet any of the side characters until super late in the book, so they don't really get any development. So that's why it's 4 stars instead of 5 stars. But he himself is actually a pretty good like narrator to follow just because he feels so unique and he has such an interesting perspective, and this poor kid just cannot catch a break. So I would recommend Half Bad at 4 stars. The third book I read is called The Power, and this book okay, here's the thing with this book. The premise is cool. Basically, suddenly, all over the world, women and girls just get superpowers, and there's no explanation for why. They just get superpowers. And this book is basically like, you know, it's like an inverse. It's like, it's society, but this time, the women are in charge. And they start going apeshit. And I guess the point is that women would be as bad as men if we had the same amount of power. Okay, here's the problem with this book. It, like, doesn't have a clear plot. Like, none of the characters are driving the plot. They're just existing in this world where this thing has happened. And some of it is interesting. Like, we follow this Messiah-like girl, but we saw her from the beginning and we know she's not shit. We follow, like, this reporter dude, and then we follow this, like, tough British mafia girl. And, you know, they all meet, you know, they all interact, but I don't know, I just didn't really care about any of them. Obviously, the mafia girl was, like, the most fun to read, but none of them were, like, driving the plot. It was so global what was happening that none of the characters really mattered, and I'm not a huge fan of that, if I'm not gonna lie. I would say a couple other things that were weird is just how apeshit the woman went. As soon as we got power, we were, like, and pillaging and murdering, and we were just, like, torturing men, and we were doing some crazy shit that I don't know. Like, if I suddenly got superpowers and all the women in the world suddenly got superpowers, my first reaction wouldn't be, let's make all the men suffer, you know? Like, that just wouldn't be what I would do. It's basically like electrical power, so they can, like, cause other people pain, and the strength of it is different in different women. But, like, I don't know, if I had that, I wouldn't necessarily, like, try to take over the world. But it just seemed weird, like, how instantly all the women were so, like, power hungry and vicious, just because they were regular people before this, so it's just kind of weird. I didn't like how there was such a weird, the plot didn't make any sense. There's something at the end, so basically at the end there's this like huge war, all the people who want to stop the women from taking control of everything, and this giant group of militant women led by one of the characters we follow, the Messiah character, who we know isn't really a Messiah. Yeah, so basically there's a huge war, and we don't know exactly, well, it's implied who wins, but like that's how it ends. Like there's no, it's just like, oh, there's this war brewing. But there was this one thing. So at the very end of the book, the author writes this letter talking about the book. He, trying to get this book published. So he talks about stuff he found about maybe a time where men were actually in control. And he gets a letter back from his agent. So basically, so the author is a woman, but the letter part here is pretending that it's a man. So he's writing about the book, and he's writing about, like, all the things that happened in the book from a point very far in the future after women got powers. And his agent writes him back and talks about, like, oh, I love your manuscript, but she says this thing at the end here. She says, Neil, I know this might be very distasteful to you, but have you considered publishing this book under a woman's name? Because the author is actually a woman. So the person who's writing to get this published is Neil, but the author is actually a woman. So I guess the point is, if women had power, everything would be exactly the way it was if men did, down to publishing under a woman's name, the way women used to publish under men's name to be taken seriously. So I don't know, it's an interesting premise, but it's a little too black and white for me. I feel like they could have done a lot more cool. They could have shown more, like, subtlety, rather than women doing, like, really violent, terrible shit, like, for no clear reason. So I would say that one is 3 stars for me. So I recorded 2 of the other books in Boston because I didn't want to bring the books back, so I just recorded them there. The first of those is The Handmaid's Tale. As you can see, the cover is from the show. I don't know why they did that because it's kind of fucking ugly, but we're not here to review the show because I haven't watched it. We're here to review the book. Well, actually, okay. I watched 1 episode of the show, and I have to say that 1 episode of the show covered, like, I would say a solid half of this book, which could be good, could be bad. There's not a lot of, like, plot in this book. It's more like her situation. So yeah, that 1 episode of the show I watched before I read this was literally a solid half of this book. But anyway, so for this book, there's a couple confusing things with it. One, the author is not a believer in quotation marks, which means when someone's speaking, there is nothing distinguishing the dialogue from thoughts. So that's just, if that's gonna bother you, don't read this book because she does it constantly. But I actually think this helps a lot. Her stylistic choices are always used to really emphasize the feeling of the scene. So if she's in a very stressful scene, the writing is very stress-inducing. So I think it's always done well. I was surprised that I actually really did like this book because it is very, like, oddly written. Turns out this book is actually from 1985, which I did not fucking know because the show just came out. For some reason, I thought this was recent. It was the cover. The cover made me think it was recent, but it's not. So I was wrong. Okay, here's the other thing. So this is another confusing thing. So the book is split between past and present. It's the world, our world, as we know it, and her world, which is, you know, super sexist and controlling. So it'll split between the past and present between those worlds, and I will say there's not a clear split. So her thoughts, she'll be thinking about something, like she'll just be waiting in a room, present day, and then her thoughts will just go to the past, like in the way in real life that will happen, but there's no distinguishing from the past and present. Like there's no break, it's just the next line is the past, and that can be a little confusing sometimes. She switches pretty quickly with no explanation. So if that's gonna bother you, or if you're easily confused, you will probably be confused for this book. So she has a lot of interesting concepts in this book. Some of my favorites are how she shows that in a society this oppressive, everyone is unhappy, even men, in the most powerful men in the society, the commanders, even they're unhappy. Everyone is just in this state of, like, constant fear and just general unhappiness, and I think she does a really good job showing that. The author's thoughts are very interesting to read. There's this sort of, like, melancholy feel. The author is not, like, a typical hero. She's not, like, a badass, oh, we're gonna take down the system, this is a revolution. And she even challenges you in the book. She said, what would you do if you were in the society? There's a foreword at the beginning of this book where the author says that she wrote this as a way to prevent it from happening, which I think is very important to note. And the book ends with this level of uncertainty. Like, we don't know whether Alfred's okay. We don't know whether there's a revolution. We don't know whether people are ever free again. This could be what the world is until the end of time. So there's no, like, conclusion, and there's no true hope. It's just, you can choose to believe the character got to a happier place, or you can choose to believe that she never did. I think the concepts in here are very good. I think they're executed very well, and I think this book is going to get my first 5-star rating just because of its importance, the fact that it's still relevant to our culture today. They're making the show now, like I said, and just that the themes that are in this book are just very well executed, and they're very easy to pick up. Like, there's certain ways that her thoughts, actually I could compare it to The Catcher in the Rye, where her thoughts are very, like, realistic. They're just run-ons. Like, if you were having a conversation, for example, you could start thinking about something in the past and there's just no transition in your thoughts, so there's no transition in the book. So I do think that that works very effectively, but it is confusing. But because it's so effective, I'm still gonna give it 5 stars. So this is my first 5-star review. I think everyone should read this book, honestly. Or I guess watch the first episode of the show, but really read the book. Okay, so actually I'm gonna cut in here and quickly add some stuff about The Handmaid's Tale because I don't think I explained that very well, and that, again, is my only 5-star book, so I just want to give a quick update on that. Okay, so I saw Caitlin Bennett, Gun Girl's, tweet about how women shouldn't vote, and it made me think that I should make a video maybe just on The Handmaid's Tale and modern feminism, because her tweet, like the content of it, was very similar to the character of Serena Joy in The Handmaid's Tale, which is someone who's very like Caitlin Bennett. Serena Joy was an online TV personality who advocated for bigotry and that women should, like, belong in the home, and she advocated against women's rights, against gay, against rights in general. So Serena Joy is pretty similar. She was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pretty white woman who said sexist, racist things. Sound familiar? But basically, Serena Joy gets a position of power in the book because of her role in the original world, the way I'm sure Caitlin Bennett would. And Serena Joy is miserable. She's miserable. They're all miserable. Everyone is miserable in this society. And I think there are a lot of really cool concepts in The Handmaid's Tale just about... I think one of my favorite concepts, actually, was when women lose their power. So they no longer have control over their own money. Their husband has the power. And throughout the book, Offred has been speaking very positively of her husband Luke. He's like her beacon of hope. But then there's this part when Gilead and the world before start merging, like it starts becoming the same timeline. And she talks about how when Luke suddenly had all this power over her, how everything felt different, how she felt like he was already starting to patronize her. He was like, oh, I'll take care of her, I'll take care of you. And he was talking about how we can survive this, and she was like, there's no we, you haven't lost anything. And she was showing how this difference in power has made it so it's impossible to truly have a healthy relationship, even between two people who love each other so much, that it was simply this act of creating a society in which them being equals was impossible that took away their ability to be happy together. And in the last part of Luke's section, the last part before the timeline becomes Gilead, in our world basically, Luke and her start doing the devil's tango, and she doesn't want to. She's just not into it. She doesn't feel anything, and Luke just keeps going, because he wants to. And he asks her what's wrong, and she doesn't really know. And he basically I wouldn't say he takes advantage of her, but he just, he does what he wants to do. Actually, what I think one of the most interesting parts of it is about the scene is she talks about how she feels like she's no longer herself anymore. She's his. And of course, Luke, he doesn't really understand this. He can't understand this feeling. And she thinks that maybe he likes it. He likes that she is his and she's not her own person anymore. And at the end of the chapter, she says, was I right, Luke? By the time that she wanted to ask, it was too late because she couldn't afford to lose him anymore because, at that point women couldn't hold jobs and couldn't do anything. So as soon as if she lost her husband, she would lose everything without him. Yeah, so I thought that was very interesting. It's very powerful. I think all of the messages in the book were very well executed. Gilead was terrifying because we know it can happen now. I think that was the most interesting part because the book is set in Massachusetts, which is liberal as shit. And so the point is, if this could happen there, it could happen anywhere. And the point is that all those people, basically all those men, who do support women's rights, who do believe that we are equal, at the end of the day, when we're afraid, they're not going to stand up. They're not going to say anything, and neither are the women. And it's this concept that we live in a society where we only exist with power because we're allowed to by men. And when they've decided that they're done with that, that's that. There's no way to fight back. And I thought that was what they did the best in the book. It was showing how the society could exist in a world that was so progressive, even for 1985. How men and women let this happen. How people like Serena Joy paved the way for this to happen. And how those people exist in our world. And the point is with Offred, is we don't know how her story ends. We don't know if she ever makes it out of Gilead. The book ends with her getting into a car with people she doesn't know to possibly be taken to freedom, to Canada, to escape Gilead, or to be taken to be tortured forever. And we don't know what happens to her, because when you live in that society, you don't know what happens. We don't know if Gilead ends. We don't know. So the point is that we have a duty to make sure Gilead never happens, because there's no certainty once it exists. So I think that book was so extremely powerful, and that's why I gave it 5 stars. It is definitely the best feminist text I read. It is the type of book that I think this book was trying to be and was not. And now we're on to American Gods, the book that everybody has and nobody fucking read. You cannot convince me that a single real person read this book, because I know so many people. I was like, this book has really good reviews. Haven't you read it? And they own it. They own the book. And I'm like, oh, so have you read it? And they're all like, no, because nobody has read this book. It just exists. We all know about it. A lot of us have it. Nobody has read it, but I did. I read this book, so now you don't have to. You're welcome. So here's my main complaint with this book. It's 600 pages. And maybe that would work if it was a little more concise, but it's not. There are a lot of meandering threads, and it really does. I feel like this book would have been really good if it was like a solid, maybe like 400 pages. A tight 350, you feel me? Basically what this book is about, it's about this character named Shadow, who's in prison, and he gets out of prison and he learns that his wife is dead, and that was the only thing he was looking forward to. So then he gets roped in with these American gods to basically save the gods of the old world from the gods of the new world. And the gods of the new world are things like the gods of television, of technology, of highways. I'm not making that up. There's literally a god of highways. And like gods of media. You know what I mean. You get the point. Or the gods of the old world are gods like Odin. Other ones, you know. There are other ones. Yeah, so basically the book is about Shadow working with the gods of the old world to prevent them from being completely eradicated. Okay, here's the thing about this book. It is definitely way longer than it has to be, and so it'll do this thing where it'll just have like these random stories that have nothing to do with the main plot, nothing to do with the main character, and these random stories will just be like, oh, there was this farm girl, she went to America, she believed in these gods, and then she died. And that's the story, but imagine that for 20 pages. So they do that a lot in these books with just these random, like, there was kid he raised in cage and then he was killed. They do that a lot. So, and they seem random and out of place, but they're also very well written. They're kind of written in like a different, more like poetic style. So they're interesting to read, but they don't seem to relate to anything. But then every single one of them ties together in the end. And I kind of love it when they can pull that off. So they have a lot of random shit in this book. But everything, no, that's not true. Not everything matters. I wish I could say that. I wish everything mattered. Most things matter. Most of the random shit in this book does come in at the end. And I would say the end, the last, I would say 100-ish pages are 5 stars. But the problem is that you made me read the other 500. You made me read the other 500 pages. For example, I can just flip to a random point in this book where there will be just a scene going on. Oh, here. Actually, this is the best example of this. Shadow moves to this small town, and in this small town, children are disappearing. And it's like a mystery that doesn't really fit into the rest of the book. And at some point, Shadow leaves the town, and then the main plot is resolved. They have the climax, and then in the epilogue, like the last 40 pages, they're like, oh wait, that mystery though. And then the mystery doesn't relate to the main plot. It's also about gods. And then they solve it. So like that... all this stuff in the small town, it was just random, and it went on for too long, and I had to read about all these old southern men, and I don't care, please. But, I would say my main conclusion with this book is that it has a lot of really interesting, like, concepts. It has really great characterization. I would say they do this thing where they'll set something up, and then it'll tie into the end, and they do that very well. They set up, there's a huge plot twist at the end of this book, and it's set up perfectly, and everything makes sense. And again, the last, like, I would say the 40 pages of the climax, it's really like 100 pages, are like absolutely perfect, and they make you feel like all of it was worth reading. But then you sit back and you think about it, and you're like, why did I read about that one old man liking the fish for 50 pages? And you're like, I didn't have to do that. Why? Why? So again, that's what I say. Like, if this book was like 400 pages, it would have just been, would have been perfect. 5 stars. It was not 400 pages. So I would say this book is like, I feel like you should, I can't really recommend it because none of the people I know who own it would really enjoy reading it, but it has like that level of satisfaction that I feel like I don't get from a lot of books. Like even like in The Handmaid's Tale, I rated that 5 stars and I did really enjoy it, but like at the end it's inconclusive, whereas this book has such a satisfying end where all the threads come together and you are just like, wow, those last 40 pages almost made me believe that it was worth reading this book. So if you're into that, if you're into that type of like storytelling where you're like, you're not sure why things are being introduced, but at the end it all makes sense, then you'll really like this book. Personally, I'm not. Again, the characters were good. There were a lot of interesting plot threads, but there was just too much random shit. So I'm gonna rank it 4 stars, but only because of the last 100 pages. Everything before the last 100 pages was like 3 stars for me. Like it was like, oh, this is well written, but I don't fucking care. But those last 100 pages though, those last 100 pages, they were so perfect. And I was like, wow, maybe men can write. Anyway, so this is a 4-star book. If you own this book, it's the middle of a pandemic. Like, read it for the culture, you know? If we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I would not recommend this book. So, take from that what you will. So I'm gonna do my wrap up now. I don't have all the books, so I will just say the ratings and why very briefly. So the first book I reviewed was Automatic Eve, which I gave 3 stars just because the beginning was so hard to get through for me and it's very boring, but it had some interesting concepts towards the end, and I would say the climax was pretty good. Then reviewed The Power, which I would give, I think I gave it 3 stars in my review, but I'm gonna change that. I actually think it's more like 2 stars. It's not badly written. It's, I would say 2.5 stars, just because this book actually had so much potential, but they chose to go in a very black and white way, which kind of felt wasteful to me. So I'm gonna give it 2 stars, just 2.5 stars, just because, I don't know, like, I don't really know what the author's point was with that. I guess it's just that if women had power, we would be as bad as men because all humans are bad? Possibly that. Anyway, on to Half Bad, which I would give 4 stars because it is the most fun book I read this time around. Half Bad was just, it was so easy to get through, the writing was just so quick and simple, and I just had a great time reading that book. So that was 4 stars. And then we're on to The Handmaid's Tale, which I gave 5 stars. It's my one and only 5-star review because I think the concepts were so important, the message was so powerful, and I think it was delivered very well. I might even still do a whole video on it, mainly just because Gone Girl pissed me off, but that's okay. And finally, we have American Gods, which I gave 4 stars because it really, I don't think it wasn't for me, but I still like appreciated it, and it had some very cool concepts, and I think it is the most successful book at bringing everything together in the end. And I really haven't been that satisfied with like a climax and like ending in so long. The ending was just so satisfying. Just everything came together. So that was 4 stars for me. So I'm not really sure what I'm gonna read next week. Right now I know I'm gonna read, these are the books I'm pretty sure I'm gonna read: Bird Box, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, possibly Angel Maker, and then I ordered some books on Amazon, but I have a whole list of books that are just in my house that I should probably get to first. So I might read The Soul of America or The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, or one of my more educational books just for fun. Why not? Anyways, this was my monthly wrap up. That's what we're doing now. We're not gonna kid ourselves. We're not reading 5 books a week, not in this house. So anyway, hope everyone's safe and doing well. Bye!